seemed to overcome the disturbing chemistry lesson about deadly methylmercury vapor that Dr. Roger Eichmann gave. This homeschool lesson had hit him hard. And then the cause of his sadness was revealed. The boy's parents had unwittingly allowed some dentist to stick the mercury inside his mouth too. He now saw himself as a biohazard. But the good news was that he was about to meet Dr. Hal Huggins, who would give him some reassuring direction.
Well, most of the people I see who are having their amalgams removed have some sort of a dread disease. But you're interested in prevention, then you are 1 in 100 who's in a very good position, because prevention is a whole lot easier than correcting a problem after it's occurred.
He asked how many dentists state that mercury fillings are safe.
Well, that would be pretty close to 100% if they want to be in dentistry tomorrow, because the Dental Association has certain rules and regulations that if a dentist is asked, is mercury toxic, and they say anything affirmative, they say, well, yes, it is. It's the most poisonous metal on the planet that's not radioactive. They're going to lose their license and be selling used cars the next day. So what they believe and what they can say, two different things.
Then he wanted to know which dentists know how to remove fillings properly.
Those people who go out and just have their fillings removed at random, by actual measurement, 63% end up with an autoimmune disease within 6 months that they did not have before they had their amalgams removed.
Dr. Huggins guided Garrett to a dentist that did know how to safely remove his filling. The boy remembered a question he had asked Dr. Huggins about retaliation for speaking out.
Yes, there have been a number of cases of retaliation. The first thing they did was put up an enormous amount of money to see to it my license was removed for refusing to place amalgam, for refusing to do root canals on patients, and writing a book they didn't like. There have been personal things that have been done against me and my family, which destroyed the family. The rest of it destroyed the business. They've destroyed everything I had except the mortgage on my home. And for some reason or other, they did not want that.
Garrett reasoned that life could have been so much easier for him if he had just kept quiet like most doctors do. So the question became,
why put yourself through this?
When you have seen the people that I have seen, and you see that their life just has a few minutes, a few hours before it runs out, and you see that that can be turned around, and you see that years later these people do have a life, that's the payment that I get. That's why I keep doing what I'm doing.
It was a refreshing ideological position that reminded Garrett of Dr. Gerson, but it still is David and Goliath. In this situation, the American Dental Association wields tremendous power and control over a dentist's life. And the dentist that performed the procedure of proper filling removal on Garrett was terrified of his identity being captured for this movie. Documents had to be signed, which meant that I was personally liable to him for the ruining of his career and income if I did film his face. Hearings on mercury fillings are now taking place in Washington, D.C. that hopefully will put an end to this amalgam disaster. It is estimated that there is 1,000 tons of mercury in the fillings of Americans at the moment. Incredibly, the FDA has never conducted an environmental assessment of the use of dental mercury amalgam as prescribed by law.
It is very important for the Orthodox people to keep patients from coming to alternative treatments because they work. People have been so brainwashed for so long.
But what could possibly be worse than dental health? Certainly food additives couldn't be that bad.
MSG is a tremendously damaging chemical. Monosodium glutamate is actually, it turns off the switch in your brain that says, I've had enough to eat. The problem with MSG, though, it's an excitotoxin.
And just what is an excitotoxin? There are thousands of studies and enough papers on the subject to fill a small library. The evidence has accumulated and then accumulated some more. It's there for anyone to read, but the processed food industry is hoping the media and the average person is too busy, lazy, or unsophisticated enough to be able to understand the subtleties of the science being discussed. But just in case the average layperson does show a bit of curiosity about the dangers of flavor enhancers like MSG, the food industry has smartly printed little rack cards and brochures to give us, defending their crisp position. Garrett met with food experts Jack and Adrian Samuels of Truth in Labeling.
The subject of glutamic acid is very, very complex, and consequently many games can be played to try to convince people that it is safe. They removed monosodium glutamate from many of their products and replaced monosodium glutamate with other ingredients that gave the consumer no clue to the presence of the reactive component of monosodium glutamate. After being told by my physician, who experienced one of my reactions to MSG, that I would soon die from an MSG exposure if I didn't learn to avoid it, Adrian used her background in research and went to the library, spending some 4,000 hours to read everything she could find about MSG. To her surprise, she found there were studies that indicated that MSG was safe, but they were all sponsored by the glutamate industry or their agents, and were all flawed to the point of being worthless. And at the same time, there were many other studies that clearly demonstrated that MSG was toxic and dangerous.
Neuroscientist Dr. John Olney has studied MSG for decades. He rarely gives interviews because of the unwanted attention it incites.
My background is in experimental neuropathology. I conducted a study of monosodium glutamate and its toxicity potential for infant animals, and I found that glutamate destroys nerve cells in the developing infant animals' brains.
I could understand his shyness about appearing on camera because he has played a key role in the incriminating evidence against the processed food industry for several years. His findings are shocking to people, especially to parents of young children. But when traveling away from home, the question then becomes for Garrett, what do you eat? At his home in Alaska, or visiting the Gerson family, his diet was virtually devoid of any processed food. It takes a little extra work to seek out delicious organic produce and/or restaurants. Stop! After all this, I didn't think. It's too late. The chemicals in this fast food were working their magic on the boy. He ate this meal, actually 2 meals, like he was possessed. To me, it was disappointing, but to force the issue would likely backfire. He was free to make his own decisions. Three hours later, on a plane headed for Jackson, Mississippi, the results were in. In Jackson, Mississippi, the boy met up with an incredible family of photographers, the Blaylocks. Dr. Russell Blaylock is a renowned board-certified neurosurgeon and author of several books on cancer, excitotoxins, and health. It is here where Garrett reoriented himself to a healthy snack, but unbeknownst to the lad, I had a little test planned.
The mass consumption of this excitotoxin substance in the food is interfering with people's ability to think and remember and use language, so that our children no longer have the capacity that their parents had. And I think this is getting compounded because there are more and more foods with multiple forms of these excitotoxins, 4, 5, 6 in a single food, so that our children, small children in particular, are consuming such large amounts. It interferes with the development of the brain as well as destroying these connections between the brain cells. And that interferes with brain function, and that's what we're seeing nationwide, and in fact worldwide in the industrialized nations. The reason that the food manufacturers are telling the public that it's safe is because they're making a huge profit off of it. And it's hard to compete with their fellow manufacturers if they don't use the MSG, because it's a powerful taste-enhancing effect. So they just tend to ignore all of this research, even though it's literally thousands of studies, and the studies keep growing, proving beyond any doubt in the reasonable mind that, in fact, this is harming people's brains. It's producing gross obesity, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, infantile diabetes, atherosclerosis. A great number of diseases are now connected to what's happening with MSG exposure.
Chips were delivered to the table that were laden with MSG.
And one of the things that people don't understand, this can be a silent toxicity. That is, they don't even know it's occurring. A lot of people will tell me, well, I don't react. I don't have these symptoms of nausea and vomiting and headaches. Well, a lot of people that are exposed to MSG will not have these symptoms, but they get the same damage. And this occurs over a very long period of time, decades. So the brain cells are being destroyed, and until they lose a number of brain cells, they're not even aware that they're under this toxicity. It's known in neurology that you have to lose about 90% of the neurons in a particular area of the brain before you develop symptoms. So by the time you develop these symptoms like dementia or Parkinson's disease, etc., you've already lost 90% of the neurons in that part of the brain, and that's what's very important. Another really new important finding is that it's strongly connected to the growth of cancer. And we know that glutamate, when it's increased in a person's diet, makes their cancer grow very rapidly and becomes highly invasive. That means it spreads all over their body. The problem is no one's telling cancer patients they need to be very cautious about taking in these food additives because it makes their cancer grow much faster and become more invasive, which means they're less likely to survive their cancer.
Garrett never did eat any of those chips. He wants all the brain cells he has. The number of food products that contain MSG but don't actually label it as such is now almost infinite. The only way to avoid this is to buy organic products and whole foods. What the boy also discovered was that this was further confirmation of Gerson's discoveries 80 years earlier. In order to provide a balanced report on the subject of processed foods, the boy then flew from Jackson, Mississippi to Omaha, Nebraska, with the hopes of interviewing a ConAgra Foods public relations representative. After several phone calls and a faxed message, he thought there was reason to be optimistic, but he was wrong. No one at this huge facility would speak. It was confusing and disturbing to the boy temporarily. For me, this heavily guarded facility and non-communicative position was supreme arrogance, especially when considering that they are feeding us, or some of us, every day. It reminded me of facilities in Alaska, such as the military's HARP project, that raises questions about the weather, or my experiences in trying to get interviews with oil companies that turned me down flat. The native people of the North and their concerns are low priority. The boy tried to contact ConAgra twice more with no reply. All was not lost, however. We went to Omaha's Mayberry Park, where Garrett found great delight once more.
We have to go back to Hippocrates. He said, first of all, do no harm. Well, every single drug does harm. Then he also said, let food be your medicine and medicine be your food. That's very important because food will nourish you and heal you. It's natural materials which your body knows how to utilize. Your body has evolved over millions of years to use. Whereas these huge, incredibly profitable companies all over the world are damaging, liver toxic, and cause disease. So how can they really be considered a medicine if they're causing disease?
If we couldn't speak to food manufacturers, then maybe we could speak to a food engineer. Meet Carol Hornline. We met her at the St. Louis, Missouri airport and were driving her to a radio interview. Along the drive, there was plenty of time for sightseeing. Garrett, in particular, now had time to digest a lot of information. He overheard much of the conversation going on in the front seat about another food additive that made him remember.
In 1974, I petitioned the commissioner of FDA about some evidence I had found pertaining to aspartame causing brain lesions.
But despite all warnings, the former head of GD Searle, Donald Rumsfeld, forced it into the food market anyway. As a highly paid and highly respected food engineer, Carol was right in line to work with this dangerous substance. It wasn't long before she was riddled with tumors from her pituitary